The winter of 1944 was not merely a season, it was a physical weight that settled over the Ardennes Forest like a shroud made of iron and ice. For the men of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, the war was supposed to be nearing its end. The rumors in the mess hall spoke of a German army in full retreat, a broken machine fueled by old men and young boys. But as the fog rolled through the dense pines of Belgium, the air began to vibrate with a sound that contradicted every intelligence report on the general's desk. It was the low, guttural growl of Maybach engines, thousands of them. Hitler's last gamble, the Wacht am Rhein, had begun, and the sleepy town of Bastogne was about to become the epicenter of a frozen hell. You have to visualize the scene to understand the sheer terror of those first hours. Imagine being a paratrooper hurried onto a cattle truck with no winter coat, no gloves, and only a handful of ammunition. You are dumped into a forest where the ground is so frozen that digging a foxhole feels like trying to carve a grave out of granite. The fog is so thick you can't see your own hand, but you can hear them. The clatter of Tiger tanks, the rhythmic marching of boots. The Germans didn't just come, they erupted from the mist like ghosts seeking vengeance. They had the Tiger tanks, the heavy artillery, and the momentum of a cornered beast. You had a rifle, a thin summer jacket, and the man standing to your left. The initial German push was a tidal wave of steel. The American lines were shattered in days, leaving pockets of confused, freezing soldiers scattered across the landscape. Bastogne was the prize. It was the hub where 7 main roads met. If the Germans took Bastogne, they had a clear shot to the sea, a chance to split the Allied armies in two, and force a peace treaty that would change the map of the world forever. The orders from the German High Command were simple: take the town at any cost. The orders for the 101st were even simpler: hold it until you are dead. By December 20th, the circle was closed. The 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored Division were completely surrounded. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. The clouds were so low that the Allied Air Force, the only thing the Germans truly feared, was grounded, useless wings in a gray sky. The men in the foxholes watched their medical supplies vanish. They watched their food rations dwindle to a single cracker a day. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks and prayed for a sunrise they couldn't see. This was the beginning of the siege, a moment where time seemed to stop and the only reality was the cold and the incoming fire. Before we move into the brutal climax of the first German assault, I want to take a moment to ask you to join our ranks. If you value the preservation of these stories and the memory of those who stood their ground when the world was falling apart, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the fuel that allows us to keep these histories alive. Now, back to the frozen woods of Belgium. The first major German probe came from the east. It wasn't a subtle attack, it was a massive concentration of fire. The German commanders, confident in their superiority, sent waves of Volksgrenadiers supported by Panzer IVs. They expected the Americans to surrender at the first sight of the heavy armor. They didn't understand the nature of the men they were facing. The paratroopers didn't have anti-tank guns in sufficient numbers, so they waited. They waited until the tanks were so close they could smell the diesel exhaust. They used sticky bombs and sheer desperation to disable the tracks. Every tree became a fortress. Every snowdrift became a sniper's nest. The forest was no longer a forest. It was a labyrinth of smoke and screams. The Germans would break through one line, only to find another group of Americans waiting in the shadows of the next ridge. The Battered Bastards of Bastogne was a name earned in blood during those first 48 hours of encirclement. Men were fighting with frostbitten fingers that could barely pull a trigger. Some were so cold they didn't even feel the shrapnel until the blood froze on their uniforms. It was a war of nerves. The Germans had the steel, but the Americans had a stubborn, almost suicidal refusal to move. As the night of the 21st fell, the German commanders realized this would not be the swift victory they had promised the Führer. They decided to change tactics. If they couldn't break the lines with tanks, they would break the spirit of the men with fire from above. The shelling began. It was a constant, rhythmic pounding that turned the beautiful pines into jagged splinters. To stay in a foxhole was to risk being buried alive. To leave it was to be shredded by air-bursting shells. And yet, through the smoke and the ice, the word spread from foxhole to foxhole: we're still here. This was only the prelude. The Germans were preparing a formal demand for surrender. Believing that no human being could endure another night in those conditions, they were about to receive an answer that would go down in military legend, an answer that perfectly encapsulated the defiance of a generation. But as the snow began to fall even harder, covering the bodies of the fallen in a pristine, cruel white blanket, the men of the 101st knew that the true test, the massive final push of the German the dawn of December 22nd, did not bring light. It only brought a different shade of gray. The fog was so thick it felt like a physical wall, dampening the sound of the moans coming from the makeshift aid stations. Inside the town of Bastogne, the situation had shifted from critical to catastrophic. The surgeons were operating in church basements by candlelight, using butcher knives because their surgical tools were miles away in captured supply trucks. There was no morphine left. Men gritted their teeth against the cold steel of the saw, their screams swallowed by the roar of German 88s outside. This was the reality of the sage's slow, agonizing attrition, where the cold was killing as many men as the bullets. It was on this morning that 4 German figures emerged from the mist, carrying a white flag. They weren't there to fight. They were there to offer a choice. They were led by a major who carried a formal document from the German 47 Panzer Corps commander. The message was clear and chillingly logical. It stated that Bastogne was surrounded, that the Allied forces were doomed, and that to avoid the total annihilation of the town and its inhabitants, the Americans must surrender within 2 hours. The German major was confident. He looked at the ragged, hollow-eyed Americans and saw a defeated army. He didn't realize he was looking at men who had already decided that they were never going home. When the ultimatum was brought to acting commander Anthony McAuliffe, his initial reaction was not one of fear or tactical calculation. He was exhausted, frustrated, and deeply annoyed that the Germans were interrupting his defense. He looked at the paper, slumped in his chair, and uttered a single word: nuts. It wasn't a heroic speech. It wasn't a carefully crafted piece of propaganda. It was the raw, authentic voice of an American soldier who had had enough. When his officers pointed out that they needed a formal reply to give to the German envoys, McAuliffe didn't hesitate. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." When the German major received the note, he was confused. He asked what it meant. The American officer delivering it, Colonel Harper, looked him dead in the eye and said, in plain English, "It means go to hell." That moment, that single word, electrified the frozen foxholes. As word of the reply spread through the lines, the morale of the 101st Airborne soared. They weren't just holding a crossroads anymore. They were defending a statement. They were the battered bastards, and they weren't going anywhere. But the Germans did not take the insult lightly. If the Americans wouldn't surrender to a piece of paper, they would be made to surrender to fire. Before we dive into the terrifying night of the Christmas bombing and the final Panzer breakthrough attempt, now, let's return to the darkness of the Ardennes. The German response to nuts was a concentrated fury. They knew they were running out of time. General Patton's Third Army was reportedly charging north to break the siege, though nobody in Bastogne believed help was actually coming. The Luftwaffe, taking advantage of a slight thinning in the cloud cover at night, sent Heinkel bombers to rain destruction on the town center. Bastogne began to burn. The orange glow of the fires reflected off the snow, creating a surreal, hellish landscape where shadows danced between the ruins of centuries-old buildings. The paratroopers in the woods looked back and saw their only source of shelter being leveled to the ground. On the perimeter, the German panzers began their most coordinated assault yet. They didn't just attack from one direction. They struck at the seams of the American lines. In the woods of Bois Jacques, the men of Easy Company who would later be immortalized as the band of brothers were facing a nightmare. The German artillery began tree bursting. Instead of hitting the ground, the shells would explode in the canopy of the pines, raining jagged wooden splinters and red-hot shrapnel down into the open foxholes. You couldn't hide from it. You could only press your body into the frozen dirt and hope the next explosion wasn't yours. The combat became a series of frantic small unit actions. There was no front line anymore. It was a chaotic scramble in the dark. American squads found themselves fighting Germans at point-blank range in the snow. Men used their trench shovels as weapons when their rifles jammed from the ice. The ground was littered with the debris of war-discarded kerosene boxes, empty shell casings, and the frozen bodies of men who looked like wax statues in the moonlight. Every time a German tank poked its nose out of the tree line, an American paratrooper would crawl through the snow with a bazooka, knowing that if he missed, he was dead. The pressure was unbearable. The 101st was losing men faster than they could count them. The ammunition situation was so dire that soldiers were told only to fire if they had a clear target. They were scavenging Lugers and MP40s from dead Germans just to have something that could shoot. And yet, despite the lack of food, the lack of heat, and the overwhelming weight of the German army, the line did not break. The Germans were baffled. By all laws of physics and military science, Bastogne should have fallen days ago, but the spirit of the 101st had become as hard as the frozen ground they occupied. As Christmas Eve approached, the men in the foxholes heard the sound of German carols drifting across the no-man's land. Still no hot Hallig. For a few moments, the guns went silent. The irony was bitter. Both sides were praying to the same God for the strength to kill each other the next morning. The Americans knew that Christmas Day would bring the heaviest assault yet. The German commanders had promised Hitler that Bastogne would be his Christmas gift. The stage was set for a final, desperate clash that would determine the fate of the Western Front. The fog was still thick, the tanks were fueling up, and the men of the 10th Armored and the 101st gripped their frozen rifles. Waiting for the first light of a Christmas they feared they would never finish. Christmas Day 1944 did not arrive with the sound of bells, but with the roar of 1,000 engines. The German High Command, humiliated by the defiance of a single Wordnitz, decided to throw everything they had left into one final, crushing blow. They knew that time was their greatest enemy. Somewhere to the south, General George S. Patton was pushing his Third Army through the snow at an impossible pace. But for the men trapped in the perimeter of Bastogne, Patton was a myth. The only reality was the Tiger tanks painted in winter camouflage, emerging from the white void like prehistoric monsters. This was the Grand Slam assault. The Germans concentrated their heavy armor on the western side of the perimeter, near the village of Hemrel. They camouflaged their tanks with white bedsheets stolen from Belgian farmhouses, making them nearly invisible in the swirling snow. The American paratroopers, exhausted and skeletal from lack of food, watched as 18 marked-for tanks and columns of Panzer grenadiers broke through the thin line of the 327th Glider Infantry. For a moment, it looked like the end. The German tanks were inside the American lines, roaming the rear areas, threatening to destroy the command posts and the aid stations filled with wounded men. But the Germans had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the sheer localized aggression of the American soldier. Instead of retreating in the face of armor, the Americans swarmed the tanks. Cook, clerks, and mechanics grabbed bazookas and grenades. They fought in the streets, in the barns, and in the frozen gardens of Hem. They separated the German infantry from their tanks, leaving the steel giants blind and vulnerable. By mid-morning, the snow was stained with the black oil of burning Panzers and the deep crimson of a battle fought at arm's length. The Christmas gift for Hitler was turning into a graveyard for his elite units. Then something happened that no soldier on either side will ever forget. The air began to change. The oppressive iron-gray ceiling of clouds that had suffocated the Ardennes for over a week began to crack. A pale, freezing blue sky started to peek through. The wind shifted, blowing away the fog that had been the Germans' greatest ally. For the men in the foxholes, it was more than a change in weather. It was a divine intervention. They knew that if they could see the sky, the Jabos, the Allied P-47 Thunderbolt pilots, could see the Germans. Before we conclude this epic journey through the frozen gates of Bastogne and witness the final relief of the city, I want to thank you for staying until the end. Stories like this remind us of the incredible resilience of the human soul. Now, let's watch the sky turn into a storm of fire. As the sun hit the snow, the horizon erupted with the sound of radial engines. Hundreds of Allied planes descended like vengeful hawks. The German columns, caught out in the open on the snowy roads, had nowhere to hide. The P-47s ripped through the Tiger tanks with their machine guns and bombs, turning the German retreat into a massacre. But more importantly, the C-47 transport planes appeared. Thousands of colored parachutes began to fill the sky, dropping the most beautiful sight the 101st had ever seen: crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and real food. The battered bastards cheered from their frozen holes, their voices hoarse, watching the supplies drift down like manna from heaven. Despite the air resupply, the siege was not officially broken until the next day. On December 26th at 4:50 p.m., the lead tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division finally punched through the German ring from the south. The first vehicle to reach the lines was a Sherman tank named Cobra King. When the tank commander saw a ragged, filth-covered American paratrooper standing by the road, he didn't give a grand speech. He simply asked, "How are you doing?" The paratrooper looked at the tank, looked at the horizon, and replied, "We're doing just fine." The siege of Bastogne was over, but the scars would last forever. The German army had broken its back against the stubbornness of the 101st Airborne. The bulge in the Allied lines began to shrink, and the road to Berlin was now wide open. When the world finally saw the photos of the men who held Bastogne, they saw faces that had aged 20 years and 7 days. They were the men who stayed when everyone else told them to run. They were the men who answered nuts to the face of absolute destruction. As the years pass and the veterans of that frozen forest leave us, the story of Hill 3234, the Ardennes, and the countless small stands of history remain as a testament. War is often told through the eyes of kings and generals, but it is won by the soldier who refuses to give up his foxhole. The snow has long since melted in the Bois Jacques, and the craters are now covered by thick green moss. But if you stand there in the silence of a Belgian winter, you can still feel the echo of that defiance. You can still hear the ghost of a single word, whispered against the wind, that stopped an empire in its tracks. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. The courage of the past is the light for our future. I'm your host, and this was The Stand at Bastogne. We'll see you in the next chapter of the Great Wars.